So as I mentioned, a little over a year ago, we offered to members of the Federation, to assisters, associates, agrégés, partners in mission, a chance to listen deeply together in the Global Synod. And that was in its first phase. That first phase wrapped up in terms of the listening phase in June 2022. And from there, Episcopal conferences across the world were charged with synthesizing this listening, which is no small feat. And so that occurred over the summer and early fall last year. And just to kind of give a small portrait of what happened in the United States, I know it unfolded in a lot of different ways, depending on where you lived. And in the US, almost 70 million Catholics were consulted. And there was a synthesis report published by the US Conference of Bishops. And I think it's an important document and inflection point for the church here in the United States, because there was a level of honesty that I frankly was surprised by, in a good way. And so I think that is a sign of hope for me, and I hope it is for you as well. So in September, a whole slew of folks, laity, priests, women and men religious, gathered in Italy, and they came together to synthesize all the continental fruits. And so they published what is called the synthesis document in late October 2022. Okay, so we're a little over 6 months ago. So this document was, I would say, nothing short of miraculous. It held a vulnerability and a way of participating that I frankly didn't anticipate. And it was really profound. And the theme of that comes from Isaiah 53, which is the call from God to enlarge the space of our tent. And that may be something you've heard in the maybe past couple of months. So that brings us to the next phase. And I'm going to advance my slide here in a moment. Okay. I just talked a little bit about the diocesan stage, the consultation, the great listening to the people of God. And we know that went in fits and starts, and that's very real. So from this document that was released at the end of October 2022, every Episcopal conference across the world was charged with saying, we got to listen to the people of God once again. Thank goodness, right? And so they went into the continental phase of this, and that was over the winter, or what is winter in North America. And I will go into a little bit of what the US and Canada process was in a moment, but just to kind of give you a scope, that lasted through March 2023. And I think what was really powerful about that is you saw people respond in their context. And so since then, we're now entering what's called the universal stage. And that is where the gathering of the Synod will happen in Rome in October 2023 and October 2024. So I want to just give this really high level overview because I think it's easy to get lost in the details. And so I know this is, for me, helpful to understand what's going on. The other point too, I think that's important for us to know as members of the Federation and as members of the people of God, is that this news isn't necessarily getting shared out with like regular Catholics and regular folks. And I think that's our responsibility. I think it's the responsibility of bishops' conferences. And I also think it's the responsibility of God's people to do. So I'm here to kind of help facilitate that a little bit more. Okay. All right, so I want to give you some highlights and some good news from the global church. In Europe, the assembly, there were 200 people in person, and they gathered in Prague. The Asian Assembly met in Bangkok, Thailand in February, and there was a real sense of everyone having a voice. So you see on the screen some images from those gatherings. The Middle East Assembly gathered in Beirut, Lebanon. And one of the themes that came out in that time was that synodality, this way of proceeding as church, is a core tenet in Eastern churches. Latin America and the Caribbean approached this continental phase a little bit differently. And much of that reason is they've already been enacting this way of synodality and way of kind of consulting locally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is great. And so they had 4 regional meetings instead of one big continental meeting. That happened in El Salvador, in Santo Domingo, in Quito, Ecuador, and in Brasilia, Brazil. And almost I thought this was really interesting. Almost half of the participants in these meetings for them were lay people. The church in Africa gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And there were about 200 people there. And the majority were lay people, consecrated and young folks. And one of the things that came up in that time, and by the way, these continental documents are available on the Vatican Synod website. So anyone can access them. They're in multiple languages, including English. So you could go and spend a lot of time reading them. I'm just here to give some of the highlights. And one of the themes that came out from Africa was that as a synodal place, they recognize and do not flee from the wounds of God's people, and that they're called to weed out authoritarianism, indifference, and clericalism. The church in Oceania gathered in Fiji and focused on how they're called for formation for mission, how they're called to be synodal. And also, I think this is important in terms of context. How are we called to care for the oceans? That's really an acute and very present reality and concern for God's people there. Okay, so that's some high level what's going on globally. Now, in April 12th, I believe, the North American document came out. That was a synthesis of the continental phase. And unlike other Episcopal conferences, it was the US and Canada that came together, which was historic. The decision was made to have all virtual assemblies. So there were 12 assemblies 12 virtual sessions that happened in the winter. The majority of those were in English, though several of them were in Spanish and in French as well. And every bishop was charged with selecting folks to participate from their diocese or archdiocese. And over 90% of dioceses participated in the Continental Assembly phase. On the left of the screen, you can see some numbers. I won't read all of them to you, but just to highlight, there were over 900 people who were consulted in this phase. And there was a presence. It was about 50% women and 50% men. I do not know if anyone identified as like gender non-binary or trans, but that is the stats that were given to us. And one of the major pieces that came out from this was the spirit of co-responsibility. And it's really rooted in this sense of common baptism, which we all know to be true and beautiful, but that we're all called by God and gifted by God with dignity, and we're called to act in the world. The document, oh, you can't see the PowerPoint, Cynthia. Can other people see the PowerPoint okay? No. Well, that would, thank you.
No, Lisa, I haven't seen it since you started talking about it.
Oh,
Okay.
Me either, Lisa.
Oh, shoot. Sorry, y'all.
There you go.
All of a sudden I heard you say
Okay.
something about you can see in this chart, and I realized there was no chart.
Okay. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay. Well, this will be a good reference point for you all. Okay, so North American final document. I'm going to give you a moment to look at that. The numbers of who participated. And again, this was all virtual. And 3 key themes emerged. In there was a team of folks who gathered and did a synthesis of what occurred. And that team met for about a week in February. And the 3 themes were called and gifted through baptism, communion with Christ and one another, and sent forth on mission. The document also included priorities for the Synod gathering in Rome. Okay. So that's kind of high level what is included. I just want to spend a few minutes showing you these themes and how they came up. And what is on the screen here is both the theme and then kind of the subheadings that are included in the document. So first, called and gifted through baptism. We're called to act responsibly and not to wait until everything is perfectly figured out, which I think is an important piece of this. And I tried to include some quotes from participants that were included in the text. So we're called and gifted through baptism. This points us to co-responsibility, to the theme of women, to the theme of engagement with youth and young people, and ongoing lifelong formation and formation in synodality. That's theme 1, called and gifted through baptism. Theme 2 is communion with Christ and one another. And this section, I think, was important as someone who's a justice promoter to really pay attention to. In the first paragraph of this section, there's an explicit naming of the lack of trust and credibility that persists because of the clergy sex abuse crisis in the United States and Canada, and also the pervasiveness of residential boarding schools in Indigenous communities over the years. And so I think that, again, was surprising in a good way that that was named explicitly, and that that trust really has to be rebuilt. And there are many opinions and many desires of how that trust can be rebuilt. There was also a sense of call for greater inclusion, for a listening church, and for formation in synodality. And one note I will mention here is that in this theme, it was kind of this real naming of an emphasis on polarization that exists in the United States. And there was a quote called "a strong pull towards fragmentation." There was not, however, any explicit acknowledgement of how the church might perpetuate or further polarization. So I thought that was an interesting note. And there was also a whole list of folks who feel that were listed as who feel unwelcome. And kind of this notion of, has the church, have people left the church, or has the church left them? So that's the second theme. The third theme is one of being sent forth on mission, called to go to the peripheries, a church that goes forth. And this section really highlighted the notion of tension and this kind of living in the world, but not of the world. There was also a real emphasis and desire for greater in-depth formation around mission and Catholic social teaching. I thought this quote from a participant from the second session was, "These people have not left the church, but the church has left them. How do we go out and minister that to them and exude that joy?" I think it's an important call. Okay, the last point on this is the priorities directed to the gathering in Rome. One is a greater call for formation in synodality and the spirituality of discernment. As I read this, I kept thinking a lot about the gifts and the talents of the members of the U.S. Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. And this is something where I think we can really share with others, is the gifts of discernment and formation. There was also the priority of challenging and welcoming those who felt excluded, a real emphasis on co-responsibility, addressing unity and communion amidst the realities of polarization and division. And there was an interesting note at the end of these priorities that talked about how the global church and the global engagement has really been something that challenges the U.S. church to go out to the peripheries. Where are the peripheries in our midst? The only other note I want to make, which is probably on your radar, but maybe not necessarily, is that there was a really historic move at the end of April that happened. And here you can see on the screen a headline from National Catholic Reporter Online that there will now be participation of the synod voting participation extended to lay members, so to non-bishops, to non-priests. And this cannot be, I mean, this is huge. That's not the most articulate way to say it, but this is a very big deal. The folks will gather in October 2023. And there's an anticipation that about 70 non-bishop members will be at that gathering. 10 from each of the 7 global bishops' conferences, with a specific request. I don't know how this will unfold, but a request that young people be included and that 50% of those names that are put forth be women. Historically, 10 members of men's religious orders have been elected to participate, and that has been changed as well, but to 5 women religious and 5 men religious. There will no longer be auditors, which is an important distinction from, for example, the Second Vatican Council. And there is the introduction of the role of facilitators. Of course, other delegates and experts and folks from other Christian denominations, et cetera, are welcome to, be in Rome. So I'm curious what the facilitation piece will look like. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll see if there's any questions before we move on.